Richard Goodall was never shaped by bright stages or formal music lessons. He was born in 1969 and raised in Terre Haute, Indiana, a town defined by routine, hard work, and familiarity. His childhood soundtrack came not from conservatories, but from a Radio Shack stereo in his bedroom, where he sang along simply because it made him feel alive. Music wasn't a plan or a dream, it was a companion. No one trained his voice or taught him stage presence. What he developed instead was something quieter and rarer: instinct. He learned phrasing by listening, emotion by living, and control by repetition. Growing up in the Midwest meant expectations were modest and ambition was practical. Richard didn't imagine himself becoming famous. He imagined going to work, doing his job well, and maybe singing a little along the way. That grounding would later become the very reason millions believed him the moment he opened his mouth on national television. 23 years in the same hallways. Long before America knew his name, Richard Goodall was known simply as Richard at West Vigo High School and Chauncey Rose Middle School. For more than 2 decades, he worked as a janitor, arriving early, staying late, and doing the uncelebrated tasks that keep schools running. He cleaned hallways, checked restrooms, fixed small problems, and helped teachers whenever needed. What made him unforgettable wasn't his job title, but his habit of singing while he worked. Music echoed through empty corridors before class and during quiet afternoons. Students didn't see him as staff. They saw him as the singer who made ordinary days better. He never asked for attention and never performed for applause. Singing was simply how he moved through the day. That consistency, the reliability of his presence, made him part of the school's identity. If Richard was gone, people noticed, not because he was famous, but because he mattered. A private life and one steady belief. Richard Goodall kept his personal life largely to himself. For years he lived quietly, focused on work and routine, without sharing much about relationships or long-term plans. That changed when Angie Van Overen entered his life. Their connection wasn't dramatic or public. It grew through everyday interactions and mutual respect. Angie saw something in Richard that he had never fully claimed for himself. She believed his voice belonged beyond hallways and empty classrooms. When Richard dismissed the idea of trying again for America's Got Talent after a rejection in 2009, Angie didn't. She encouraged him patiently, not chasing fame, but possibility. For Richard, music had always been personal joy, not ambition. Fame felt distant and unnecessary. But Angie understood regret can be heavier than failure. Her belief didn't push him to become someone else. It reminded him that staying small wasn't the same as staying true. That quiet encouragement would change everything. The video that changed everything. In May 2022, a student recorded Richard singing during a school break. It was unpolished, unplanned, and under a minute long. Within days, that video traveled far beyond Terre Haute, spreading across Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Millions watched, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. Viewers were struck by the contrast, a janitor singing with the control and emotion of a seasoned performer. That clip reached America's Got Talent producers, reopening a door Richard believed had closed forever. When an invitation arrived in January 2024, his first instinct was to decline. He wasn't chasing a second chance. But Angie reminded him this wasn't about chasing anything. It was about honoring what he already had. For the first time, Richard considered that sharing his voice didn't mean betraying his life. It could simply be an extension of it. Stepping onto the AGT stage. In March 2024, Richard Goodall boarded a plane for the first time in his life, leaving the Midwest for California. He arrived at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium without a manager, a stylist, or a strategy. He carried a small suitcase and a cautious sense of faith. When his audition aired in June, it stopped the room. His voice wasn't about power or theatrics, it was about sincerity. Simon Cowell called it believable. Sofia Vergara was visibly moved. When Heidi Klum pressed the golden buzzer, It wasn't framed as luck, but recognition. Audiences didn't just hear a singer, they saw a lifetime of honesty in one performance. Online, the clip exploded, trending for weeks. What made it resonate wasn't the novelty of his job, but the feeling that nothing about him was manufactured. Richard didn't perform a story. He lived one, and people recognized themselves in it. Choices that reflected who he is. Throughout the competition, Richard made careful choices. In the quarterfinals, he sang, "How Am I Supposed to Live Without You?" focusing on restraint rather than range. In the semifinals, he performed "God Bless the USA" with controlled emotion, honoring the song without excess. Each performance reflected his personality, steady, grounded, and sincere. In the finals on September 24, 2024, he sang "Faithfully," dedicating it to Angie, whom he had married just a week earlier. Then came a surprise collaboration with members of Journey on "Don't Stop Believin'." When Richard was named the winner, it felt less like a victory and more like a shared moment. He didn't celebrate loudly. He accepted quietly. The $1 million prize mattered, but not as much as what followed, the recognition from former students, co-workers, and people who saw dignity in his path. Returning where he belonged. Just 3 days after winning America's Got Talent, Richard Goodall returned to West Vigo High School, not for cameras, but for work. He unlocked doors, checked hallways, and resumed routines that grounded him. The community, however, refused to treat it as an ordinary day. Students, teachers, and residents organized a surprise rally. The mayor presented him with the key to the city. Richard thanked everyone briefly and went back to work. Returning wasn't symbolic. It was necessary. He continued part-time, not for money, but for connection. Fame hadn't erased the meaning of those hallways. At the same time, Richard and Angie married quietly in Pasadena, choosing intimacy over spectacle. Even after winning, he avoided endorsements and reality television offers. He wasn't rejecting success. He was redefining it. For Richard, staying rooted wasn't resistance to change. It was respect for who he had always been. Building music without chasing fame. After AGT, Richard didn't disappear. He simply moved carefully. He sang the national anthem at an Indiana Pacers game, appeared on Howie Mandel's show, and scheduled an intimate concert in Lafayette, Indiana. He began working with local musicians, recording demos without pressure or deadlines. His style leaned toward soft rock and adult contemporary, music built on feeling rather than trends. He expressed interest in collaborations, but refused to build his path on borrowed fame. Offers for commercial endorsements were declined. Richard made it clear that music for him was expression, not currency. He balanced time between Indiana and Pasadena, maintaining routines that kept him grounded. He stayed in touch with former students and still answered calls from the school when advice was needed. Progress didn't require abandoning his values. It required patience, intention, and the courage to grow without losing himself. A legacy rooted in authenticity. Richard Goodall's story resonates not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. He didn't reinvent himself to fit entertainment. He let entertainment meet him where he already stood. Online, his performances continue to gather millions of views, shared by people who recognize something rare, authenticity without pretense. He has been compared to other unexpected stars, but he rejects labels. He doesn't want to be remembered for winning a show or hitting a high note. He wants to be remembered as the same person before, during, and after the spotlight. That consistency is his true legacy. From school hallways to national stages, Richard Goodall proved that success doesn't require abandoning humility. Sometimes it simply asks you to keep singing even when no one is listening, until one day the world does.